several folks joining us that way, up to 40, I think we looked today, Tim and I, 40 to 45 folks
Wow.
are taking the class that way. And so it's just another example of how we're able to reach folks in new ways. And as I keep telling the staff, time is no longer an issue. People can worship, they can learn, they can do anything at a time that works for them, which is pretty remarkable, really.
Yes.
It's so good to have you. Great to have Ken with us again. And we're looking forward to a great evening of learning tonight. If you got a chance to read chapters 4 and 5, you know that D'Angelo has done this masterful work of, in the first couple chapters, letting us dip our toes in. And these were the two chapters where she kind of took us and threw us in the deep end. And has probably pushed some buttons and maybe even pulled some triggers that pushed us a little bit, I hope, because she's really helping us explore and look at our whiteness. And so I'm grateful that you're willing to do this work with us tonight. Go ahead and mute your Zooms unless you're talking. That'll help us a little bit tonight. And I'll be kind of trying to watch and see if we're getting other folks on board. Just a reminder, on the bottom panel of your Zoom screen, you can go to the chat function. We'll use that at the end of our class. But also, if you have other questions as we're going through, that's a great way to chat. If you push chat over on your far right, you'll see a place where it says "To Everyone," and then you can type a message there. And then that way other people can see that if you have questions or want to explore something a little bit more deeply. I've got us recording for the session, and we'll go ahead and get started. Let me open with a word of prayer. We thank you, God, for the gift of this evening, for a time where the sun goes down and we anticipate some rest, and yet you continue to invite us into this time, into this moment of learning together. We pray a blessing of your Spirit upon us as we find ourselves being cracked open to some new ideas and some ways of understanding that challenge us and also enlighten us. And for all those gifts, we give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen. Got Robin joining us too now, so great to have her with us as well. Let me go ahead and put up our work for tonight. Hopefully everybody can see that. Do let us know if you can't. We don't have a video embedded this week, so hopefully I won't have technical difficulties like last week. We're on session 3 of our study and continuing through the Sunday nights of July. So hopefully you'll be able to continue joining us for that. Our learning objective, again, to create safe space, to be nudged into uncomfortable discussions and feelings. And hopefully as we're continuing into the July classes, we're not only exploring how to be racially sensitive individuals, but what it means to be a part of a racially sensitive and racially woke Christian community. And that's a big part of what we'll be talking about tonight and into the coming weeks as well. Just our learning covenant, to remember that we want to make sure that we're making space and taking space when it comes to our small group conversations. We'll do 2 tonight. Folks have expressed to me that they've appreciated that space, so we can do kind of some individual relationship work, but also get into some of our stories that we can't do with 30 people or 20 people, but we can maybe in groups of 3. So hopefully you're leaning into that and finding that not only helpful as you speak some of your truth, but also hear the truth and the wisdom of others. So here's our centering moment. Invite you to find a place in your book or in a journal for you to reflect on this quote from Common. Common is a Chicago rapper, but this is his birth name right here. That's quite a name. I would love to know the story of how he got all those names, but the centering moment, if we just take about 2 minutes to reflect and just kind of center ourselves into this space for learning tonight on his quote, "Black people are not afforded the room to be human." Let's just take about 2 minutes and reflect on that as we're getting ready to learn together. Okay, gives us a chance to separate a little bit from whatever else has filled our day and get into a space of learning and reflecting together. So what we're going to do is break into our groups. What worked last week was if you want to go ahead and take a picture of this frame on your phone, just take a picture. That way you have the questions that you want to be talking about in your groups. We're going to break into groups of 3. And I noticed last week the groups of 3 took our 2 or 3 couples that we had learning together and put them all into a room. So you all had 6, I think. Hopefully y'all got a chance to both share ideas and hear. But why not just have us reflect in our small groups about what did you learn about yourself as a white person in these chapters? And maybe there's just a core concept that you can draw from that for that answer. And then how do you experience racial relaxation because of white supremacy? D'Angelo explains this as that emotional and intellectual space that people of color are not afforded as they move through their day. I'll share an example of one of my best friends who's an African-American clergywoman, and she went to her church where she was serving as pastor, a primarily Anglo congregation, and she went to their garage sale. And she was just shopping through the aisles, if you will, in the fellowship hall of the garage sale. And a woman who was volunteering, who was not a part of the regular worshiping congregation, but was volunteering to help with this garage sale, followed her through the garage sale, watching what she was looking at and picking up and putting into her bag. We get to racially relax when we shop. Most white people do. And what does it mean for us to be able to do that and others not to be able to do that? So if you want to take a snapshot of that question, I'm going to go ahead and stop share and get us into groups of 3. And let's take about 20 minutes for this conversation. Let me get our groups here. How many people do we have? 17. So there we go. Okay, we'll be going into groups and then we'll gather back in about 20 minutes and I'll give you a 60-second reminder. Oh, Lynn, you got to join us. Great.
Yeah, she was part of our group. It was great.
Great. I didn't see her before.
Were you not in a group, Amy?
No, not this time.
Yeah.
Usually I join.
Yeah. Oh, Lynn, we can't hear you. She's like, I know. Oh, wow. Golly, everybody's got.
Yeah, it's like.
That was quick.
The ringing all happens at the same time. I don't know about anybody else, but that Zoom doorbell sound, I have nightmares about it when we've been on Zoom so much sometimes. Great, I think we've got everybody back. Thanks so much for your conversations and hopefully that drew you a little bit more deeply into the material from this past week. Has anybody yet still had problems getting a book, or are we starting to be able to all read and go through the book? Anybody have any issues? Okay, good. We've got quite a stash of them now at the church. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen again and have an opportunity for us to do some of the key idea work that we do each time that we gather, looking at some of the key ideas and concepts from chapters 4 and 5. So Ken's going to take us through the first bullets, and then I'll be taking us through the last 3, and hopefully we'll up against some of the ideas and thoughts that you had as you were reading too. But feel free to use the chat if you have specific questions or ideas. I'll pause the PowerPoint presentation after Ken's part and see if you have some chat questions, because I can't see those at the same time that we're running the PowerPoint. And then we'll go ahead and do the other 3 bullets and create some space after that for some chat as well. So I think I can go ahead and give you the ability, hold on here, to move through yourself. I may have to stop share and set that up real quickly here. There we go. Okay. So I think, Ken, you can forward the slides now. Are you muted, Ken? Yep, you're muted, Ken.
Yep.
There you go.
Okay. Now I'm unmuted, and I think I'm going to. I don't think I can forward the screen. Oh, maybe.
You did.
Okay. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. We're going to start by talking about whiteness is normal and neutral and valuable. Let's see. Well, it looks like I'm just kind of having things cycle around here. I think I hit the space bar too many times.
Does that work, Ken?
Well, I don't know. It isn't, is it? Don't I just have a blank screen there?
No, we have the screen up that says whiteness is normal, neutral, and valuable. I can click them if you need to.
Okay. So yeah, so let's go down one slide. But the first thing I wanted to just kind of think about is that white people we hide our racism, and we hide it in our unconsciousness. I've been actually, over the past week, I've been reading about dog whistle racism, which maybe you've heard of it before. It's the idea that when particularly this happens with politicians, but also with advertisers and others, where they say something that actually raises the racism within us without actually talking about racism. So, for example, a politician might talk about the need to have strong law and order to stop criminals, and say nothing about racism. But for white people, they hear, oh, they think murderers, that's black people, and so that it kind of raises the racism without actually saying anything about racism. And then the comeback on that by the politicians, for example, is say, well, I wasn't being racist. There wasn't anything racist about that. That was just my expression of concern about people's safety. And the same thing happens, as D'Angelo points out, that we don't even think about something as being strange. So she points out that you put the list of rich people and they're white, and you to say, well, isn't it sort of strange that in America, white people have gathered all of this wealth, but there isn't that same gathering of wealth that we see in the black community. And then this thing kind of goes further. We just think, well, it's overseeing is normal. We don't raise a question about that professional coaches are white, even though the players on the National Football League are majority black, and yet where do the coaches from? They come from the white players, and and that the question about senators or others just isn't part. It just doesn't come as part of our natural thinking about things. I think. Do you want to go? Okay, there we go.
Thank you. So I thought I'd think about that even in what happens to us in church, that we just think that what's happening in church is normal and that white is the way things are. I wonder if you might think for a moment, even when we had a black pastor at our church, how often was race really discussed? I mean, there were times, I think of last Easter's sermon, the last Easter sermon that Eric gave, that he talked about race and so on. But even from other churches, when I think about the church that I grew up in Iowa, I don't think, I doubt that, I would guess there were whole years that went by when race was never even mentioned. And the church just assumed that, this was all normal, that racism wasn't part of our national story, what was happening to us, or it was just, okay, it doesn't even need to be mentioned. So why is that? Why is it that whiteness can just be normal and natural and we don't even discuss it? You want to go to the slide? So one of the reasons for this is that race is just a non-issue. As D'Angelo just quoted from page 55, that the internalization that people who aren't white is forced upon them because race is always there for people of color, and that it's constantly a presence, that what is a black person doing here, or how am I doing this, that might impact something in a white world, of living in a white world. And so this being a non-issue was a big part of my thought about how these chapters really fit together too, of making it, and so that we have to think, okay, what is happening that's racial around us? I think of it as putting on a kind of filter, and people do this for lots of things. I'll just give you one example, is that the United Methodist women, for a period, and maybe still do this, would train other United Methodist women to watch for what was happening in relation to gender at United Methodist meetings. And so there would be an assigned person to just watch, say, what happened when a man spoke? What happened when a woman spoke? How seriously? How often did a woman say something, it was kind of ignored, and then the man said exactly the same thing, and all of a sudden that was the topic. Well, that's the same experience that African Americans are living in all the time, or Hispanics are living in, that kind of environment where the what's happening is clouded by the events of who's talking and where's talking, or what's happening. Consciously and unconsciously, race is just ever present for non-whites, and makes it, and so that unless whites are intentional about it, which I would hope is part of what we're gaining in this whole discussion, is a sensitivity to become make race more present in our conscious and in the things we're talking about. So, which is actually where Amy's going to take us next.
Yep, I'll take the handoff here, but first I'm going to stop the share real quickly and just see if there are any comments that y'all want to make or questions for Ken. Camille says it's just what we were raised and conditioned to think about, that white is right. Other thoughts? Sue?
Susan's got her head in.
You don't have to type it if you don't want, so you can just unmute.
On Friday, I listened to Science Friday on NPR, and they were interviewing a Dr. Carolyn Finney, who's African American, and she's written a book, Black Faces, White Spaces, about, you know, the out of doors and African or minorities in general, basically. But the point that she made that really got to me was that in a country that emphasizes individualism, a Black represents a whole race. You know, it's not just that individual. It's all the good and bad things that anybody who's African American has ever done. And that's a very heavy burden to have to carry.
Yeah. Good point.
Well, I would say that when I talk about I'm responding, Ken, to when you are saying that we don't talk about race very often. And I think when this topic comes up for me, I feel incredibly guilty that I have as much as I do. And the other feeling I have is an incredible fear that I'm going to say something wrong. And so those are the two reasons why, I'm sure there's more, but those are the two things that I really can see in myself that make it hard to have this conversation.
I think that's where, this is Betsy, I think that's where trust comes into it, and where relationships, I think a part of why we don't talk about it is because we haven't built the relationships with people that we can talk about it. We talk about it with our white friends without anyone of color in the room, but that doesn't do anything. I mean, you know, we can talk about it till the cows come home, and so oftentimes, well, Amy knows a lady that's at our church. Her name is Barbara, and she's a Black lady, a beautiful, absolutely gorgeous Black lady. She also has her PhD in psychology and is just to be admired. But she and I have a neat relationship, and we talk about some of these things, and probably we'll talk a lot more about these things, but it's because of the relationship that I feel safe saying. You know, I remember saying to her a few years ago, oh, Barbara, don't worry about that. Just like the book says, I said, I don't even think of color when, you know, and she said, she looked me straight in the eye and she said, if you don't see color, you don't see me. And I thought, what? You know, it was like the first time that I'd ever had someone say anything like that. But I just think trust, relationships where trust has been built are so key to this. And we can't have that conversation in our churches if our churches are all white. You know, if there are no Black people there that we can build a relationship and trust. So the onus is on our backs, I think, to make sure that when we have those conversations, that we make sure that all are included. And I will say one other thing that Jack and Catherine and I were talking about. It's in regard to what was just said there just a moment ago about we lump all Black people together. In the book, it feels like so oftentimes she almost lumps all white people together. And it made Jack and I are talking. It almost makes you angry because I want to say, you know, I'll claim this racism, but don't put me in the same category with a white supremacist. Well, I guess if we lump all black people together, if that's how they feel, it's like no matter who they are, they feel like that we're lumping them in categories with the looters, not the protesters, but the looters, and the Black Panthers from the 60s, and, you know, some of those kinds of issues. So that was eye-opening when she said that. It was like, oh, well, there's a good example, because we had just talked about not wanting to be lumped together as a group.
Yeah, Nancy, I just want to react to one of the things that you said about if we aren't in a situation where there are non-whites to participate in conversation with them. Right now, I'm in Ohio, where my grandchildren, I have 3 grandchildren here, and we've been here for a couple of weeks now. My grandchildren are white, and we've had conversations about racism that we just never did before. I wonder why didn't I have these conversations with my grandchildren? Why didn't they know that Kathy and I had decided one vacation we were going to go to the Rosebud Indian Reservation, and that's what we were going to do for our vacation, and tell them about what we learned there and the people that we met and what that was, and talk about the Trail of Tears. So I think that there's also opportunities where we can spend time sharing. It opens us up to talk to white people as well, to understand racism better.
Katie?
I just wondered if one of you could address, it was on the bullet and I won't be able to quote it accurately, but it was the statement that white people hide their racism. And it was the word hide that I just found myself noodling, because it seems like if you're going to hide something, you first have to be conscious that it's there. So is it that do they hide it, or that they don't know it's there?
Well, I'll speak a little bit to that. Maybe you want to say something. I think it may even be an unconscious hiding of watching our language. The kinds of things that we say when we're in mixed company is different than the way we might talk when we're just with white people, and that the kind of things that we would just automatically sometimes share automatically, we would hold back, just like people do with the preacher, of to hide things from the preacher. And so I don't know, maybe you want to say something about that, Amy?
When to Robin's point earlier, I think sometimes we hide because we are afraid that we're going to say something inappropriate or distasteful. And I have found that sometimes the best way I can handle that is by saying in a mixed company experience, or, you know, in a relationship with a friend who's African American or Hispanic or any minority, I know I'm going to say something that's not right. I know that I'm going to kind of muddle through, and sometimes I can kind of be self-deprecating about it and saying, you know, I usually don't have a problem finding words, but I do right now, because I'm just working on this and I don't understand it. I say that to my daughters when they're trying to help me understand the plural pronoun for a person who chooses not to be identified as male or female, or him or her pronouns. They choose to use a plural pronoun, and they'll jump all over me and say, Mom, you don't get it. And I said, you're right. For 53 years, I have learned that people fall in 2 categories, and I am unlearning that, and I'm going to mess up, and I need to beg your forgiveness now. Please teach me. And I think sometimes that's just the way we approach an experience like that. And that's a much more gracious way than going in as an authority with white privilege and white superiority, or heterosexual superiority, to say, yeah, I got this all figured out. So that might be something to think about too, Katie. Great conversation. We'll keep moving on. And if you have other questions, we'll pause as well. Let me go ahead and go back to our outline. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, let's see, let's get to the next one. There we go. White Jesus, Black Jesus. She talks very briefly about this topic, but it goes back to the idea of a normative, that whiteness is normative. And so I want us to think about, where does that come from with the way we even understand Jesus? Now, this statistic in the first bullet, I've seen a variety of high statistics. 90 is a little higher than I've typically seen, but most scholars believe that by the 1500s, so we're talking about the 16th century, which is when we're seeing this explosive growth, especially of Protestant Christianity, and moving forward. 90% of Christians were European, and the world and Jesus were becoming colonized. What that means, obviously, is that the images of Jesus were being made in the images of the followers of Christ, which were predominantly white Europeans. There was an understanding in art of a widespread white Jesus by the 1800s. And if you start to look at art and the images of Jesus that come out of these ideas that whiteness is normative and whiteness is normal, about the 1800s, we're going to start to see most of those images being white. And then, of course, the Warner Sallman head of Christ. And we're going to look at that for a moment, but that's probably an image you saw in churches, hanging in your homes. And it was first drawn by Warner Sallman, who was a Chicago, actually, commercial artist for an evangelical Swedish youth magazine. So he wanted to appeal to young people. He wanted to appeal to a Swedish evangelical population, which would be white skin, blue eyes. And that image of the head of Christ was so pervasive that that image was given out by the USO to World War II soldiers, by the YMCA, by the Salvation Army. There was even a movement called Christ in Every Purse, that there was going to be a picture of white Jesus. And that was started by, at the time, President Eisenhower and Norman Vincent Peale, who many of you have heard about through history. Dr. Anthea Butler, who's a professor in Afrocentric studies and religion, says every time you see white Jesus, you see white supremacy. What not only was white Jesus a part of most of our formations, but also it was a picture hanging in most of the Black churches. And here's the piece of art. Oops, somehow that's just going by itself. So here we have white Jesus, or what we call in some of my churches, spray tan Jesus. One of my churches, in fact, the one where Betsy goes to now in Missouri, that we had a spray tan Jesus picture of this head of Christ, and it would just pop up in different people's offices randomly. But here's an image of Jesus that most of us grew up seeing: long, flowing, dark blonde hair, blue eyes, very white features, right? Or you may have seen this one, this head of Christ. This picture of Jesus, I call him Sexy Jesus. Sexy Jesus was hanging in our family room in our house. And I'm like, man, if this is what Jesus looked like, I want to follow him. I also want to marry him. I thought he was pretty sexy looking, but again, no Middle Eastern features, maybe a nice suntan, but very Anglo features.
He looks like hippie Jesus.
Hippie Jesus.
Right.
Hippie skippy Jesus. That's right. So we've got these pervasive images, and let's just think about the power of image and art when it comes to forming and fashioning our picture of Jesus. For how many people, whenever you think of Moses, do you think of bronzed Charlton Heston, right? Those images are pervasive in our ideas. And imagine these pictures hanging in Black churches. What would that have meant? Some people have commented, for a Black community, that meant that the slave owner that had white skin looks like Jesus. And if the slave owner is like Jesus, and Jesus is resurrected and will never die, perhaps racism will never die. So I wanted to just give us an opportunity now to see some other images of Jesus. This one by Sophia Minson to the left of Spray Tan Jesus is a picture of an indigenous face with tattoos. And he's got kind of a hawk on his shoulder. What would your image of Jesus grown to become if that would have been the picture hanging in our churches or on our stained glasses? Or down below, the bottom left corner is called Jesus Christ Liberator by Richard Lentz. And more of kind of an icon, in a Greek Orthodox icon kind of look. But what would have happened in our sensitivity and power of image about who we thought Jesus was if we were constantly seeing any of those pictures below? Think about how that would have dismantled the power of white supremacy. Here's another one by Kim Ki-chang, The Last Supper. What if that was the image of the Last Supper that we saw constantly instead of Michelangelo's? Or no, Da Vinci's Last Supper. How different would we have found ourselves with power and with understanding of our identity to Christ? This one actually received an award, this Jesus of the People, received an award by the Catholic Reporter in 1999. Janet McKenzie drew this dreadlocked, Afrocentric face with a wider nose, larger lips. The black cloak around his shoulders is understood to be kind of the burdens of the darkness of the world. And the white cloak is his purity and his presence from God. I wish this would have been a piece of art hanging in the churches I grew up in, because it would have completely altered all kinds of images for me about Christ. James Cone, who's a very famous Black theologian who actually died in 2018, has this quote in some of his work. And I'm just going to read it and let you think a little bit about the power of image and how that resonates with this unconscious bias or this unconscious racism that Ken talked about. The Black theologian must reject any conception of God which stifles Black self-determination by picturing God as a God of all peoples. So the question, one thought is how did white Jesus, spray tan Jesus, the head of Christ, how did that fail in our ability to see God of all peoples? Either God is identified with the oppressed to the point that their experience becomes God's experience, or God is a God of racism. The Blackness of God means that God has made the oppressed condition God's own condition. This is the essence of the biblical revelation. By electing Israelite slaves as the people of God, and by becoming the oppressed one in Jesus Christ, the human race is made to understand that God is known where human beings experience humiliation and suffering. Wow. So what Cone's suggesting is that we need to rethink our images of Christ as not spray tan Jesus or surfer Jesus, but one who has experienced humiliation and suffering. Liberation is not an afterthought, he says, but the very essence of divine activity. So I'm going to invite us to go back into groups of 3. I don't know if Zoom will make those same groups or not. And if there's a way to do that, I wouldn't know how to do it, I have to confess. But take a look at some of these images of white Jesus. I grew up, my paternal grandparents owned a funeral home in LaSalle, Peru, Illinois. And downstairs was their funeral home business and upstairs was their home. And so my sister and I would spend summers with grandma and grandpa, and I experienced everything that a funeral home, as you can imagine, had to experience. The experience of worship and the sanctity of that space of grief, of embalming bodies, of being quiet while grandpa held the service. And they had a 12-foot picture of Jesus knocking on the door, this one that you see here on the picture. That was my formative experience of Jesus. White, bronzed, dark blonde hair, blue eyes. So I'm going to invite us, first of all, if you'll take a picture of this so you don't forget, to discuss the formative images or pictures of Jesus from your past. And how did those images form your thinking? Think about the stained glass windows in the churches of your childhood. Think about the images that you saw. If Jesus was white, this is a hard question. What distinguishes our Christian faith from any other normative white institution, such as patriotism, scouting, or being a good citizen? None of these things are bad, but they're normatively white. The question is, if Jesus is white, what distinguishes us at all from those organizations? And what might a new image of Jesus look like that tells the story more of a Jesus as a Middle Eastern liberator than a white American citizen? So we'll take about 8 minutes for this time. I'm going to go ahead and close the screen share and get us back into groups again for just about 8 minutes. And actually, I think this will take us back into our groups. I'm going to join one of your groups.
We want to know, Amy, was that really 8 minutes? It didn't seem like long enough.
It was. I have my little timer on to make sure.
I knew you would.
But yeah, this evokes a lot of conversations and memories, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. How we were formed. In one of my, Webster Hills, which is another church in St. Louis, the first piece of art you saw when you came into the office area was a picture of in the fields. It's a famous picture, but it's African American women gleaning in the fields. That was the first picture we saw coming into the church. And I said, when I got there, this is not going to be the first image that we see when we come into the church. So images are powerful. Do we have everybody yet? Let's see. Okay, we're going to go ahead through the next slide and really not get too much of a chance to spend on it. But I do want to encourage you to read it again, this ignorance and innocence of our racial past. And one of the things that D'Angelo says, I think, that is so profound is a romanticized past is strictly a white construct. But it's a deeply powerful construct because it calls out to a deeply internalized sense of superiority and entitlement, and the sense that any advancement for people of color is an encroachment on this entitlement. I took the bold step to just lift a quote from the speech that was given up at Mount Rushmore this past week by our president, and this isn't a political statement at all, but simply I'm letting his words speak for himself. But what it basically was an invitation to a past that has ignored every other person of color through our monuments and through the ways that we gather and remember our past, and an innocence of white fragility that is just a fine history. So that's something that I'd encourage you to take a look at and read at another time, because I really want to spend time with this graphic. This graphic is basically chapter 5, the good-bad binary. And it's I found it to be such a helpful guide to the way we have ordered life. And I think back to probably one of the most prevalent ways that this good-bad binary has been lived out in our modern era, which is around abortion. When the abortion conversation and the complexities of human reproductive health and women's choices about their body and how society understands life and death, when it became a binary conversation between pro-life and pro-choice, we eliminated all of the mess and the hard experience of what is the conversation around abortion and human sexuality and rights, didn't we? And that's something that our society, our American society, does. We polarize, we divide, so that we can focus more on deflecting the charge of being bad or good rather than reflecting on my own behavior, according to what D'Angelo says. So this is a chart that's in the reading for chapter 5 about how we have done this around race. So we have polarized the good-bad binary by saying a racist is a bad person, and all these words have been attached to what a racist is. And a non-racist is a good person, and we've attached all these other elements. And what it allows us to do is to say, I know that I am not a bad person because I'm not a racist. Rather than, if we find ourselves in the not racist column, a progressive, educated, open-minded, well-intentioned, young, and northern, we don't have to reflect on our own racism if we find ourselves in that good guy side. Does that make sense? When in fact, sometimes those of us who find ourselves in the good guy side really can be much more covertly racist. So let me use another example of that. I think that in the scriptures and in the gospel, this is the kind of behavior that Jesus calls out the most in the Pharisees. When they say, okay, Jesus, are you going to heal on the Sabbath or not? Are you going to break the law or not? It's these good, bad binaries. And Jesus is constantly saying to the Pharisees, look at yourself. You don't get to measure yourself by the badness of others or the badness of me. Jesus is constantly calling the Pharisees and Sadducees to reflect on their own behavior. Because as long as they live in this good-bad binary, they get to decide that someone else is worse than them. And they don't have to think about what the worse in them is. Does that make sense? So I don't know about you, but I'm a consumer of Facebook, which is good and bad. I love the connections. I love the relationships that I have with people. But and you can watch this, we see this good-bad binary played out all the time. All the time. Where we see, for instance, just instead of putting racist equals bad and non-racist equals good, put conservative equals bad and liberal equals good, right? By doing that and by living in that good-bad binary between conservative and liberal, or put Fox News on one side and MSNBC on the other. When we do that and find ourselves in the good column, we don't have to spend any time reflecting on our own behavior because we're always focused on the bad behavior of the other. Does that make sense? Here's some other words you could put at the top. Trumpers on the left and progressives on the right. When we live in that good-bad binary and we simply measure life by whether you're bad or good, right or wrong, left or right. You don't have to focus anymore on your own behavior because we have a whole lot of people we think are bad. And that's the behavior Jesus called out over and over and over again with the Pharisees. Here's another way. On the left column, put Walmart, and on the right column, put Whole Foods. Right? I mean, how many videos have we seen on Facebook about Walmart shoppers? And it's people that aren't dressed like we are, maybe have tattoos that we don't, maybe carrying a firearm in the store that we won't, those kinds of things. So we don't have to reflect on our own behavior because we got somebody to vilify. So I just invite us to really check that good-bad binary as we're consumers of social media, as we're watching the news, as we're hearing the way news is scripted around race, that how quickly we all jump to these conclusions about the bad and the good and the left and the right that protects us from having to look on our own behavior because we're always deflecting the bad charges against the other.
So Amy, if that's true, and especially as the election is coming up, what's a better way to address that? And because, you know, there's a certain politician who's dividing that up for people, and it puts you on the defensive just automatically.
Right.
And if you don't want to be, then how do you do it?
Yeah. That's the $1 million question, isn't it, Katie? What about if we reflect on a faith that is much more generous in the middle than the polarities of one extreme or another. What about, again, back to the way we generalize, like Sue mentioned about one race. When we do that, it's easier for us to reflect on the bad behavior of those people or whatever group we want to vilify and instead reflect on our own thinking and our own sin. I think Robin, through the social justice work, invites us to really think about, why are we doing this? Are we just doing it? Are we making decisions about social justice with our votes because we're just triggering against another group? I think that Jesus would challenge that. Or because we're leaning into this social justice position because of the gospel and what we're taught as Christians. Does that make sense? So I think sometimes we can really kind of check ourselves and say, am I making this vote just because I don't want to be one of them? Or am I making this vote out of a consciousness and an awareness of my faith and the social justice principles that I choose to live by? Does that make sense? What are some other thoughts y'all have about that good, bad binary?
So try not to be maybe so defensive,
Yeah.
Open-mindedness is helpful, but it may not be good in all situations. Like you had the binary list of good is open-mindedness.
Mm-hmm.
But I think getting rid of your defenses comes to mind.
Good point, Barb. And, even just asking someone with whom we differ, can you tell me more about that? Now, there are some people that will shut us off, right? And we've seen examples of that they don't want to have a conversation. And let's be honest, there are principled issues in my own life I don't want to have a conversation about. I just know it's right? So I'm not suggesting that just the other side feels that way. We all have those filters, to kind of go back to Ken's words. But and there's times when Jesus even said, right, when he sends the disciples, I'm going to send you into these towns and villages, and if they won't hear you, shake off the dust and move on. There's a point at which there's not a readiness to engage. And I appreciate that from Jesus. It's an honesty of, we need to lean into creating that generous space that breaks down this binary, but not everybody's going to do that. And we also have to recognize my initiative on leading people out of that binary comes out of my privilege, right? I'm exercising some of my own privilege as an educated pastor, as a white person, to ask a person of color that has been carrying these wounds throughout their life, hey, can you tell me more about that? They may say, screw you. I don't need to waste my time trying to convince you of this, right? So we need to understand out of our own privilege from which we enter into these engagements. But any other thoughts about how we break, back to Katie's point, how we break some of this binary living, talking, and relating?
One thing that I think we talked in other classes about is the whole idea of when we become very superior feeling to the others, that we remember almost all of us have someone that we love and may love very dearly who is a part of the others. And so sometimes I think it helps me to just put that face right in front of me and think, they all aren't to be grouped. And the other side had beautiful opinions based on their learning and their values.
Right. It's a great strategy.
I think if you're talking any particular issue, my fallback is always, there are lots of shades of gray in between. We don't have to pick one or the other. There may be good points on both sides that we can come to some common ground on.
Right, Lindy. And that's breaking down that binary thinking, isn't it? It's saying there's another way to approach this. And I think that was very much Jesus. a big part of his approach was what we like to call a third way approach, that it's not just one or the other. There's a third way. There's a more creative way of coming together, even as he confronted this binary theology that the Pharisees and Sadducees were using all the time. Even the disciples got caught up in it, right? You know, what are you doing, Jesus? Healing on the Sabbath. What's going on here? You know, and he has to break that and say, now, wait a minute. What's the spirit of the law, not just the law? Any other reflections?
I think it's just interesting because I think what Katie brought up was that when you go to vote, it's very binary.
That's right.
Like you have two choices, and sometimes there's a third candidate. And with issues, you know, pretty much it's two choices. You can vote yes or no, and so I think what you're inviting us to do is to be very as educated as we can about the nuances of the issue or the candidate. And then when you know, on that particular day, when you go to vote, you do have to choose one or the other. But that doesn't mean that you're saying 100%, you know, one way. You're saying 80-20. You know, you're saying, I acknowledge that this is not a perfect initiative that I'm voting on, that, you know, it could be better. I acknowledge that this candidate wasn't my first choice. So you have to kind of, you know, you have to be a little binary on election day, but that doesn't mean that you're going to do that for the rest of your life, you know. Just the more educated and nuanced that I can be, I think, makes me a better person.
I appreciate that, Robin. And you know, I once had an ethicist teacher who said, sometimes it's about choosing the best way, not the right way. And the best way might be the best way with the options that we have, but it may not, it doesn't always mean it's the pure right way. And that's a struggle. And I depend on the community of faith to help me discern some of those decisions, right? Kind of ethics 101.
Recognizing that everything is a compromise.
Yeah.
You know, and that's
I
hard
think
sometimes.
what's sad is that some people are going to vote the opposite way for the very same reason.
That's right.
If they want to be guided by Christian principles, they're going to vote in a completely opposite way than I will. And I don't know how that ever gets reconciled.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the questions we can always ask out of our white privilege, but also aware of a gospel that calls us to that third way is, okay, whose voice is not at the table of this decision? Who is going to be hurt by this collective decision? Even some of the best decisions may not ultimately make everybody's life better, right? So I think that those are Christian ethic conversations and questions we can always ask. Who's not at the table? Who's not benefiting because of this? Even though it may be for the greater good, there's somebody that's going to be left away. So I think this chapter was just so critical to helping us think through some of the ways that we get sucked into a culture that makes everything around binary decisions. And as Christian people, we're called to be in a different space. So let me take us back to our shared screen just to wrap up and invite you to continue to think through some of these topics as you do your reading and reflection. Let's just close by taking about 2 minutes just to chat on our chat screen about what did I learn and what will I do from our conversation tonight. And I'll go ahead and make sure that we have our chat up so that you can take a look at and see what other people are chatting about. So we'll take just about 2 minutes. I know we're running over about 5 minutes. So if you need to go ahead. But otherwise, we can kind of learn by just being quiet and reading each other's reflections. Thanks for your feedback. And I think by reading each other's, it's also possible for us to be praying for the accountability that we all want to be held in as we get opened up and get placed into new spaces with God and with our own thinking. Just a reminder, and I'll go ahead and share the screen to remind us. Next week, we'll be doing chapters 6 through 8. So a little bit more reading. You can keep on using the Zoom link for next week. If you can't join us, we invite you to be sure to click on the recording, and we put up the recording of the session as well as the PowerPoint. So even if there was a conversation starter for you tonight that you want to share with somebody else, feel free to pass that on, and that's all available at our Faith and Race site on the church website under the White Fragility Study. So again, thank you so much, Ken. Thank you so much for guiding us and for rooting us tonight in this important conversation. I appreciate growing and learning with each of you, and I pray you have a great week. If you haven't had a chance to worship yet, we get to visit Red Rocks, so I hope you'll get a chance this week to worship with us sometime, and be well, and we'll look forward to gathering next week. Okay? Take care. Thanks for letting us run over a little bit tonight. Be well. Bye-bye.
Thanks.